So with Avengers Doomsday coming down the line, a lot of people have asked for a reading order of what comics they should be checking out if they want to get ready for Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. So let's kick things off here with essential reading, and then I actually have some unessential reading suggestions for you if, like me, you believe that Doctor Doom has taken over the body of Tony Stark in the MCU. So going into the list of essential reading, number one, Books of Doom by Ed Brubaker and Pablo Raimondi. This is the quintessential origin of Doctor Doom in Marvel Comics. Now, one of the things that makes it so essential is because of the fact that what Ed Brubaker does here is he actually pulls a bunch of different elements from Doctor Doom's history over the course of Marvel into one mini-series. But if you were ever going to read an origin for Doom, this is it. Conversely, you can go read the old Fantastic Four annual if you want to. And you could even read Fantastic Four issue number 5 when he was first introduced, but neither of those really provide the breadth of information that Books of Doom does. The second story here, this is Emperor Doom by David Michelini and Bob Hall. You can also read One World Under Doom, but we'll kind of take these in turn. So Emperor Doom is basically the answer to the question, what does it look like when Doctor Doom wins? Right. In essence, he ends up taking over the world. The book is as much a philosophical quandary as it is anything else. Because again, while you can probably imagine everything goes back to normal, Doctor Doom basically loses his control of the world. The question that's asked here within the superheroes, but really us as the reader, is that if the world was devoid of war and conflict and any of that stuff, under the control of Doctor Doom, and that now things are back to normal, people are actually more terrified and a lot more standoffish and more defensive than they were before Doctor Doom seized control, then is the world actually better off? So it's one of these stories that kind of asks questions and somewhat uncomfortable questions, because it was written at a time when Marvel Comics wasn't really afraid of doing that. Nowadays, they don't really do that anymore. You just get a story where Doctor Doom does some stuff and that's it. And that's kind of what you get here with One World Under Doom. Now, I don't want to dismiss this, right? There are some things that take place in this book that really begin to ask questions like, how far would you be willing to go to attain absolute power? How much is okay, and where do you cross that line of unacceptability, right? That kind of thing. And those individuals who have read that comic know exactly what I'm talking about here. The reason why I kind of separate this and why I say that One World Under Doom is a story that you could read if you chose to is because One World Under Doom is a crossover, whereas Emperor Doom is Marvel Graphic Novel 27. It's a standalone story. You literally just buy the book, read it, done. That's it. That being said, because One World Under Doom is a crossover event, it's far more expansive, and there's a whole lot more that goes on with that story than simply just Doctor Doom seizing control of the world. So honestly, I'd probably recommend both, but if you have to choose one, I would say go with Emperor Doom. The next story here is kind of coming out of left field a little bit, full transparency. This is Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom, Triumph and Torment. This is written by Roger Stern and drawn by Mike Mignola. The reality, and something to know, this is one of the most essential Doctor Doom stories of all time, right? If ever there were like a top 3 list of stories that anybody should read, if they were ever interested in Doctor Doom, this is going to make the list, no matter who it is that you talk to. But the reason why I say it comes a little bit out of left field is because I don't imagine that Marvel is going to pull a lot of elements from this story, but it's not to say they won't, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe does have a history of taking elements from stories and then reworking them and adapting them to make them work in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For example, the idea of Thanos showing up on Earth during Infinity War and trying to capture the Infinity Stones, that's from the Cosmic Cube saga. Right? And coincidentally, it was actually during that story that Drax the Destroyer ended up becoming Drax the Destroyer, or at least lost his family and was set on the path to becoming Drax. But what the MCU did is they took that whole thing, reworked it, and then basically threw Infinity Stones in, which Thanos has come to Earth hunting for Infinity Stones. In fact, he did it recently, but I'm digressing. If you look at Jonathan Hickman's Infinity, that introduces the Dark Riders and it introduces the Cull Obsidian, right? So Corvus Glaive, Proxima Midnight, Supergiant, all those guys. So again, the Marvel Cinematic Universe will take stuff and adapt it. The reason why I'm including Doctor Strange, Doctor Doom, Triumph, and Torment is because this is the story that basically brings an end to the entirety of Doctor Doom's reason for trying to attain grand levels of power. It's Doctor Doom and Doctor Strange going to hell in an effort to free the soul of Doctor Doom's mother, who at one point had made a bargain with Mephisto, not understanding what a bargain like that entails. Again, I doubt you're going to see any event in Avengers Doomsday or Secret Wars where they quite literally go to hell. But what this story will do is it'll provide the idea that Doctor Doom is a far more complex character than we're used to, and it introduces the concept of motivation. So they may very well take the character of Cynthia and then the whole idea of her selling her soul to Mephisto and just chalk it up to something else and give Doctor Doom a different motivation. But if nothing else, it's a great story that will give you a much better understanding of the nature of Doctor Doom. That being said, of course, no lists like this would be complete without Secret Wars 1984, Secret Wars 2, and Secret Wars 3 if you feel like it. Something to understand, Secret Wars 3 should not be confused with Secret Wars 2015. They are not the same thing. And in fact, a lot of people don't even know that Secret Wars 3 exists. So Secret Wars from 1984 is the quintessential Secret Wars story. You walk up to anybody who's familiar with Marvel and you ask them, have you ever read Secret Wars? The first thing they're probably going to think of, depending on how old they are, is Secret Wars 1984. This is the arrival of the Beyonder. This is when he takes the heroes and the villains, or at least the most popular of these groups, and he has them face off against each other, that whoever it is that comes out on top will have their wildest dream come true. It's the story where Doctor Doom steals the power of the Beyonder, that kind of thing, and then ultimately ends up losing and Secret Wars comes to a close. This is one of those stories that created a paradigm shift. So this is when you're introduced to Julia Carpenter, I believe, in the Marvel Universe. Small little things that happen here and there. But it is essential for Avengers Secret Wars because this introduces Battleworld. The idea that what the Beyonder had done was quite literally take chunks of places from across the universe and bring them together as this kind of patchwork planet that all the superheroes had to fight on. I will say there is actually a great what if story that builds on what if Secret Wars never ended. And there's some pretty dark stuff, like what happened with Venom and Spider-Man. That was pretty twisted, but it is pretty cool. I will also say this is a story that, because of the way that it ends, Ben Grimm actually ends up leaving the Fantastic Four for a period of time, and his role is taken over, I believe, by She-Hulk. But then that takes us into Secret Wars 2 and Secret Wars 3. Now, these aren't really important for anything you're going to see in Avengers Doomsday or Avengers Secret Wars, but they are going to be important for what we talk about later. So Secret Wars 2 focused on the Beyonder in the aftermath of the original Secret Wars coming to Earth and basically visiting it, right? Trying to understand really more the nuances behind superheroes and supervillains and stuff like that. I mean, the reality here, for being honest, depending on who you talk to, some folks will just say it was a half-assed cash grab by Marvel. And I can't entirely deny that. Was it anywhere near as good as the original Secret Wars? No, not by a mile. But there are some cool things that do go on here. One of the big reasons why Secret Wars 2 is important is because Secret Wars 2 actually fixes a retcon issue with Doctor Doom. So to kind of sidetrack here for a second, Doctor Doom had technically died in Fantastic Four 260, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But then he appeared in Secret Wars 1984, and it didn't make any sense. And so what Marvel did is they came back and they said, actually, the Doctor Doom as he appeared in Secret Wars 1984 was actually time displaced. That what the Beyonder had done is he had pulled Doctor Doom from the future into Secret Wars 1984. Secret Wars 3 builds on the element of both the Molecule Man Owen Reese and the Beyonder. As a quick explanation here, Molecule Man Owen Reese was a guy in the original storytelling in Marvel. He was a guy who was involved in basically an experiment at Acme Atomic Lab, I think is what it was called. The experiment went awry. He inadvertently created a cosmic cube, but half the energy went into him, and then half the energy went out into space and effectively became the Beyonder. What Secret Wars 3 does is it basically reconciles all of that. It gives us more of an indication of what the Beyonders are about. So whenever you guys hear about pre-retcon Molecule Man, pre-retcon Beyonder versus post-retcon Molecule Man, post-retcon Beyonder, that's Secret Wars 3 from the old Fantastic Four stories. That being said, that takes us into the next batch of essential reading, which is Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four. Now, I will say those individuals who are familiar with this run will say, I mean, look, Doctor Doom's in it, and like there's some cool moments with him, but I don't know that I would really consider this to be essential reading for Doctor Doom. And that's not an unreasonable perspective to have, because Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four is less of a Doctor Doom story, and it's more of a story that focuses on bringing the Fantastic Four back to what they're supposed to be, which, depending on who you talk to, was something that hadn't quite been happening in Marvel Comics since the runs of John Byrne and Walt Simonson. So a number of years, the Fantastic Four just felt kind of lost. The reason why I'm putting the Fantastic Four here on this list is because we will be talking about Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, New Avengers, and Secret Wars 2015. But without reading this, I would almost guarantee you'd be kind of lost with some of the things that go on in that comic. Adult Franklin Richards, the idea of Franklin showing up in the present day to basically save his father from the Mad Celestials, different things like that. This is the iconic moment with Franklin and Galactus. In case you haven't read it, I won't really spoil any more than that. It's pretty solid, and it's one of the greatest moments for Franklin in the entirety of Marvel Comics. I'm sure you've seen this image in your travels across the internet. But this takes us into Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers going into Secret Wars 2015. However, this is not exactly a very smooth reading process. I know Marvel does have trade paperbacks, they have omnibus collections, all that kind of stuff. The reality here is that Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers is not really a run that can be read in trade paperback form, just because of the fact that the way the story goes is you read New Avengers issues 1 through 3, then you read Avengers issue number 1 and 2, I think, and then you go into New Avengers 4 and 5, and then you finish out the Avengers run, well, at least the first volume anyway. So the reading order is kind of wonky. I will post that reading list down in the description so you can kind of go issue by issue, because in my mind, the reading order that I use, which is actually the one that I use when we made videos on all of this, I think it's the best way to read it. It makes it a lot more fulfilling, and it makes it feel a lot more structured and a lot more organized. But the other reason why I say that Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers is not exactly smooth sailing is because of the fact that by the time you go into the events of Time Runs Out, there's actually an 8-month time skip. Now, some people will tell you that you can read Time Runs Out by itself, and I guess technically you could, but I feel like that's like starting a TV series in like the final season. You know what I mean? Like, you want to go back and watch the whole thing that led up to that point. Unless you're like me and then you introduce Mariah to Game of Thrones with the final season, which was the worst season to start her on. She'll never go back and watch the show because of it, so I kind of ruined it for her. But I simply say all this to say you're much better off going back and starting at the very beginning of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers and then reading all the way up until the events of Time Runs Out. Now, before you start Time Runs Out, I have an optional list of stories for you to read. They are not required. However, they make the experience of Time Runs Out so much better, because what they do is they fill in the gap of what had been going on with a lot of characters and teams in Marvel during that 8-month time skip. So as the first optional story here, it's Rick Remender's Captain America, specifically the Nail storyline. This is the story that explains how Steve Rogers lost his super soldier serum. So this is why you basically go all the way up to the events of Time Runs Out, you do the 8-month time skip, and then suddenly Steve Rogers is this grizzled old man. So without this story, you'll have no clue why that happened. I mean, I guess technically they do reference it, but reading the entire story makes it a lot more enjoyable. The second one that I would suggest here is Jason Aaron's Thor, God of Thunder. Now, I would read this all the way up until it becomes the Mighty Thor, when Jane Foster becomes the new Thor. You can continue on if you want to. The only thing you really need to know going into Time Runs Out, though, is that Jane Foster's Thor. So this is a pretty iconic story, just so you guys know, right? If you talk to anybody out there who's a fan of Thor, they're going to tell you that Jason Aaron's run is one of the greatest runs of all time, and probably right up there with Walt Simonson, although some would say Walt Simonson is the best run of all time. And there's a credible argument to make there. But this is the storyline that introduces Gore the God Butcher, different things like that. But after this, you're going to go into another story called Original Sin. Now, I do have it listed here as a unessential or optional comic, but at the same time, I feel like it's also kind of essential. The reason why is because once you start Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run, you're going to notice at the very beginning, Captain America is a member of the Illuminati. It was pretty dope. And then he gets cast out. Original Sin basically shows Captain America realizing what had happened with the Illuminati. But the biggest reason why this is important is because it shows the stark character difference between Steve Rogers as we saw him before the events of Time Runs Out and Steve Rogers during the events of Time Runs Out. Because during the Time Runs Out era, he has a vendetta against the Illuminati. He's literally out for blood. And so without understanding what was going on with Original Sin, it's going to create some problems. Plus, there's also some just really dope stuff. I'm pretty sure the Original Sin tie-ins for Captain America are the ones where he ends up like 50,000 years in the future. So there's references to like Age of Ultron, Days of Future Past, all kinds of cool stuff, right? Like, I don't think it's called Ultron Forever. That's what it's called. There's also a tie-in for the events of Ultron Forever, which is pretty solid. After this, again, this is all optional reading at this point, there's X-Men Schism. Now, X-Men Schism was basically a civil war, so to speak, between Wolverine and Cyclops, and it was actually creating a rift that led the two of them splitting off and doing their own thing. Cyclops stays in Utopia, which is an island off the coast of San Francisco, and Wolverine launches the Jean Grey School for gifted youngsters, or higher education, or higher learning, whatever it is. Anyway, the Jean Grey School, right? So this shows why it is that when you go into Time Runs Out, the mutants, or at least the X-Men landscape, feels fractured, right? Cyclops is over here doing his thing, and Wolverine's over there doing his thing. So Schism explains a lot of that. But after Schism, you're going to go into Avengers X Sanction. Now, this is kind of like a mini unessential within an unessential, which is to say, Avengers X Sanction is the story where Cable comes from the future into the present day in order to effectively neutralize the Avengers, because he realizes what's going to happen with Avengers versus X-Men, which is to say, the Phoenix Force returning and the Phoenix Force bonding to the character of Hope Summers. If you don't know who Hope Summers is, that's fine. A simple Google search will take care of that for you. But Avengers versus X-Men does a really, really good job of filling you in on everything that you may have missed regarding the character of Hope and why she's important in the first place. But the reason why I even include Avengers versus X-Men is because it's just a dope story. To be honest, you get to see the Avengers and the X-Men fight one another. But it's also the reason why things seem pretty tenuous between the Avengers landscape and the mutant landscape, the X-Men landscape, within the events of Time Runs Out. After this, you can read Axis if you want to. The only reason why I would include Axis is because what you're going to read next, and honestly, this is also kind of essential, Superior Iron Man by Tom Taylor. Axis is the story that explains how Tony Stark becomes Superior Iron Man, where he's kind of a dick for the most part, which is to simply just say that all the heroes were converted into villains during the events of Axis, and all the villains were converted into heroes. There was some dope stuff that came out of Axis. And honestly, I don't think we ever actually covered it here on the channel, so it'd probably be worth our while to cover it. It was a pretty solid story. What ends up happening if you decide not to read Axis is that Tony Stark basically ends up shielding himself from the re-inversion spell, which is to say, the inversion spell is what's flipped everybody in the first place. Tony Stark basically prevents himself from going back. And so that's why when you start Superior Iron Man from Tom Taylor, that Tony Stark is doing things like using extremis tech to give people the ability in San Francisco to look beautiful. He gives it to him for a day and then charges $100 a day after that. And literally the town descends into madness. It explains how it is that he gives Matt Murdock his eyesight back in Superior Iron Man. It's a pretty solid story. It's really, really cool. But the reason why I really chalk it up here is because once you jump into Time Runs Out, Tony Stark is Superior Iron Man. And so Superior Iron Man segues directly into that. Quite literally, he takes off and then somehow ends up in captivity. But then that takes us away from the main Marvel Universe. And actually, it shifts us into the Ultimate Universe, the original Ultimate Universe, Earth 1610. What I would highly suggest you do here, if you choose to, you can read Miles Morales Spider-Man, right? I always love Miles Morales Spider-Man. I think he's one of the coolest characters in Marvel. By no means is it essential, but it's just kind of a nice little bonus read. But as it pertains to this discussion here, you want to read Ultimate Comics Doomsday. Now, this is not a Doctor Doom story, FYI. This is actually the story that explains how it is that Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four in the Ultimate Universe basically starts down the path of becoming a villain. If this was a movie, this is Star Wars Episode 3 for the character of Reed Richards in the Ultimate Universe. But that takes us into the Ultimates by Jonathan Hickman. Ultimates by Jonathan Hickman is where Reed Richards as a villain returns and then starts calling himself the Maker. Now, this is, in my mind, relatively essential because Time Runs Out will involve the Maker. And so if you don't know who he is, if you don't know how the Maker became the Maker or anything like that, then you're going to be a little confused. The great thing is that Ultimates by Hickman, I believe, is 6 issues. It's not overly long, and it pretty much gives you everything you need to understand the Maker as he appears in Time Runs Out. His relationship with Samuel Jackson, Nick Fury, basically of the Ultimate Universe, his relationship with the Ultimates, right? So again, it kind of gives you all that stuff. But once you're done doing that, you're going to go in and you're going to read Time Runs Out by Jonathan Hickman. Now, once you're done with Time Runs Out, you're going to jump to Marvel's Last Days. Now, Marvel's Last Days was a line of comics that showed basically what was going on with the various superheroes, various teams between the ending of Time Runs Out and the start of Secret Wars 2015. There are some really cool moments. Some are cooler than others, right? So if you go and you look at like the last days of Loki, for example, there's this idea that those who sit above in shadow are basically the Beyonders, or at least that's an idea that's kicked around. If you don't know who they are, not a great big huge deal, right? Loki explains it within the comics, so you don't really have to worry about feeling left out. You follow the Silver Surfer, and him and I think Dawn Greenwood, is that her name? I can never remember her name, but it's from Dan Slott's run. They actually leave the universe, which is kind of cool. They end up coming across Queen of Nevers and different things like that, but it very much becomes a kind of meta story where they leave everything in existence. But again, these are just a few, and I do want to specify, it's not as though it's read in a chronological order and that if you miss any of them, you're going to be screwed. No, it's basically a pick your poison type thing. You can just kind of grab whichever one you think is interesting and read the final days of those characters. But then that takes us into Secret Wars 2015. And a lot of the stuff that you've seen, right? A lot of the leaks that have come out there, the idea of Dr. Doom being God Emperor Doom on Battleworld, people kneeling to him, where you see these shots, or at least these mock-ups, where it looks like the old school, court from like Arthurian legend and that kind of thing. That's all from Secret Wars 2015. It's one of the greatest stories ever written in the history of Marvel Comics. So I would highly suggest that you check it out. But again, because of Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars, they are going to be pulling heavily from Secret Wars 2015. If there's any story on this list that they're going to be pulling from and that you really need to read, it's Secret Wars. I just simply want to illustrate here that if you go through and you read Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, followed by his Avengers and New Avengers, stop before Time Runs Out, and then go through the optional reading list, and then pick up Time Runs Out, it makes the entire experience far more rewarding and far more enjoyable. Again, none of those things that I listed off that take place before Time Runs Out, none of those are really essential, I would argue, outside of Original Sin. Original Sin is really kind of an essential story, but they really make the experience better. So with all of that being said, the unessential reading. So if you're anything like me, you probably suspect that what Marvel's doing in Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars is that they're going to establish that Dr. Doom has somehow taken over the body of Tony Stark. I don't know that they are, and the fact that we heard Dr. Doom's accent in the Avengers Doomsday trailer indicates that's most likely not the case. But on the off chance that it is, there's 4 stories that you can check out if you really want to see what it's like when Dr. Doom becomes Iron Man or Dr. Doom takes the body of Tony Stark. The first of these stories is Fantastic Four issue number 10, written by Stan Lee and drawn by Jack Kirby. Fantastic Four number 10 doesn't really focus on Dr. Doom and Iron Man. Instead, it actually focuses on Dr. Doom using the body swapping technique for the very first time in Marvel Comics. So it shows how it is that he's able to do this. Again, that little bit right there is really the only important part for this discussion. The second one, and this is actually a video that we did, it's a what if story called Iron Man, Demon in an Armor. It's written by David Michelinie and it's drawn by Graham Nolan. This is a story in an alternate reality where Dr. Doom uses the body swapping technique on Tony Stark. So literally, Tony's mind goes into the body of Victor, and the mind of Victor goes into the body of Tony. So if ever there were going to be an instance in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and if what we end up seeing really is Doctor Doom swapping bodies with Tony Stark, this will most likely be the story that they're referencing. I don't know that things are going to play out the exact same way as they did in the story, but at the very least, the outset of it, the very beginning of it, would likely be something that you would see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Following this, and again, we kind of mentioned this earlier, Fantastic Four 258 through 260 by John Byrne. And I just simply say John Byrne because he was writing and drawing the comic. 258 through 260, again, just kind of shows the quote-unquote death of Doctor Doom prior to Secret Wars 1984, but it also shows that even if Doctor Doom's physical body is destroyed, at the last moment, if he's aware enough, he can jump ship to a new body, which is exactly what he does. It actually ends up being a fight between himself, Silver Surfer, and Terrax the Tamer, where basically he's killed, right? And then he ends up jumping into the body of a guy named Norman MacArthur, I believe, and proceeds that way for a little while within Marvel. But it is kind of a cool little moment there. But I imagine the one story that a lot of people are very fascinated about, assuming you haven't read it already, is Infamous Iron Man by Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Maleev. Now, a lot of people will simply just tell you if you're interested in the character of Doctor Doom, this is essential reading. But because this is a video focusing on things that you should be checking out to get ready for Avengers Doomsday, I don't know that I would make this an essential read. That being said, it's dope, right? And you should 100% check it out. But it's not a story centered on Doctor Doom taking over the body of Tony Stark. That's not what happens. All that happens is that Doctor Doom becomes Iron Man. Nothing more, nothing less. It does take place after the events of Civil War II, so Tony Stark is essentially out of the picture. You do see Riri Williams eventually go on to become her own character during this era. The Riri Williams run of Marvel is fantastic. I would highly suggest you check it out. But for the character of Infamous Iron Man, this is, by and large, truthfully, a standalone story. You can walk into a comic book store, buy this comic, leave, read it, and be fine. The only thing you need to know is that Tony Stark's out of the pictures in Civil War II. Marvel in more recent years does still reference the events of Infamous Iron Man from time to time. It only really happens when they're talking about past escapades of Doctor Doom, but for the most part, again, it's one of the cooler stories. So there's your 4 suggestions for you if you're interested about the whole Doctor Doom, Tony Stark relationship with one another. And there's certainly others, right? Tony Stark, Doctor Doom going back in time and the whole thing with Morgan Le Fay and so on and so forth. But again, we're talking about Doctor Doom either replacing Tony Stark or becoming Iron Man in some capacity. So we're keeping these options relatively slim. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Let me know if you guys want some more reading orders for stuff, and I will catch you all later. Peace.